1 week season.
Hello. It is week 6, OWS family, and it is time for your bias check. Throw this podcast on 1.5 speed so you don't have to listen to me pause and search for the words that I need here. And let's get going into week number 6. A couple of really cool things for you at OWS this week. The crew has been doing a wonderful job collectively sort of painting a picture of this puzzle and asking its subscribers, right, the people of OWS, to put that puzzle together. We've been doing a great job of kind of defining and teaching people how to do that. This week, there are a number of free, very important parts of this website that are free this week. It's the player grids. So JM, Mike, Poppy, and Sonic will be giving you their player grids for free. These are more than just player picks. They're more than just the type of players that you want to pick. There's a lot more strategy that goes into these. And in a little bit, we're going to talk about one of the biases that kind of forces us to seek comfort in picks and why OWS is such a great website at combating that bias. Well, last week, not even OWS could have predicted that the Bills, the Rams, and Kansas City would all lose. It's just very improbable events that happened there. We would not have bet. Most likely, you did not bet on one of those teams being upset, much less all three of them losing in the same week. Right? The Rams lost to San Francisco. No one thought that was possible. People we're talking about San Francisco kind of giving up that game, which is ridiculous. Pro players will never give up a game, right? And the Bills losing to New England, and then Kansas City losing to Jacksonville. Again, why do we think that? Well, the Bills, the Rams, right? Kansas City, these teams have been good for so many years in a row. The status quo is that they remain good, that they remain the top of the NFL, and they may stay there. It may just be 1 week, but that status quo bias, right, sort of elevates those teams in our mind. They are the elite of the elite. They don't lose. There's another bias that creeps in here. We can call it the clustering illusion. Basically, we are uncomfortable as people, as humans, with randomness. So when a bunch of unexpected things happen, we try to look for a reason, right? Something is strange with the NFL this week. Well, what is the pattern that caused these three teams to lose? Sometimes there can be a reason, right? I need a different sort of example here. Think of the severity of the climate events over the last few years around the world, right? And the frequency of climate events. We could say it's chaos, right? This is just a period of our history where the weather is a little bit more chaotic. We can say that, but patterns in this case show that human behavior, right, has caused this climate to change and has caused the chaos. And scientists point out how it's all intertwined, right? Different things are affecting each other. There, in fact, is a pattern with the warming of our climate and climate change. So when we see chaos, right, sometimes there is no reason. Sometimes it's just chaos. And the NFL slate results in chaos more often than not. So we should not try to find a pattern with that. One of the things I kind of draw a parallel with this week is in week 5, the chalk all hit, right? The chalkiest lineups were the ones to take down tournaments. People's cash game lineups were performing, well above their tournament lineups. Cash game lineups were taking down, some smaller field tournaments. Again, Is this a pattern, or is this just the chaos of one slate? Well, again, let's look to bias to sort this out for us. There's a bias called the probability neglect. It basically says humans are bad at gauging probability. For instance, last week, the Bills, Kansas City, and the Rams, perhaps they had about a 70% chance to win. Well, if we use that as math and work on the probability, there is still a 34% chance that one of those teams will lose. Right? If all have a 70% chance to win, there's about a 34% chance that one of those teams will lose. And there's about a 3% chance that all three will lose, even on a week where they each have a 70% chance to win. Now, those probabilities can be calculated. Most people don't spend the time to calculate those probabilities and simply think, right? Well, 3% isn't such a bad outcome, right? We've probably all bet on things that have less than a 3% chance of happening. So maybe it wasn't so crazy. Maybe it wasn't so improbable that all the chalk hit. But the chalk hitting next week is similarly improbable. Meaning it's similarly improbable for all the chalk to hit as the Bills, Kansas City, and the Rams, right? Three of the top teams with the top spreads on a week to all lose. The reality is some of the chalk will hit and some will fail, and we need to position ourselves accordingly. If we give into the bias, right? So some people are thinking this week, well, I need to play more chalk. And we'll get to this at the end, right? Team jam them in, Puka, CMC, and Jonathan Taylor. Well, let's just jam in all that good chalk because that's what's been winning. Well, if we give into that, right, if we start to see patterns where there's only chaos, those patterns that we develop, that we convince our mind that our patterns can be dangerous. For example, here's a dangerous pattern. If we think that, right, the chalk is all going to hit, we will tend to give more certainty to highly projected players, right, who are in good matchups, good Vegas totals, high, good salaries for the production that we expect. So we will just pattern ourselves to look for these types of players, and we will miss out on the other players that are often necessary for DFS success. Spike week players, right, that are not highly projected in any one week. High cost players that, again, are not projected as well, but have high ceilings, just as high as Puka, CMC, Jonathan Taylor. So if we give into the bias, we may change our thinking and look for different types of players that aren't necessarily the ones that win DFS tournaments. We may also start looking at plays and giving more weight to good plays, right? If things seem certain, if it seems certain that the chalk will hit, if it seems certain that we can pick the players ahead of Sunday's lineup lock that are going to succeed well, well, that pseudo certainty effect, right, is going to drive us to looking more at individual plays, right? And again, there is player grids are free this week, but the player grids don't just give you the plays. You can use it as that, but it's much more valuable than that. It kind of tells you how to use the plays, what strategies are best for implementing that play. So don't just try to stack up a bunch of good plays this week thinking that the chalk is going to hit again. It may seem certain, but right, good plays fail all the time. And the chalk is usually a good play, and they will fail. Another reason that the chalk can fail, game scripts can evolve differently, right? We often like players in certain game scripts. If those game scripts develop differently than we're thinking, then a play that's tied to a game script can fail. And then the chalk fails, right? We also still need to be building lineups that have a high probability of getting multiple plays right at the same time. The chalk does not account for that. Last week, if you had played Josh Fields, right, Breece Hall, and Garrett Wilson, that was a correlated bet on the New York Jets offense. And if you got the New York Jets offense right, you were likely to get all three plays right. That was chalk that was sort of working together with lineup construction. So it was a very valuable player block there if you used it. But don't get distracted in this case from the game of DFS, right? Don't turn this into picking players. Let's sort of recognize this bias that we think the chalk is all going to hit, and realize what that does to us, and kind of don't let us get away from what wins us tournaments, what really helps people in the OWS community. So maintain your process this week. Don't get distracted. Don't start picking players. Yeah, I've repeated myself 2 or 3 times there, but it's important. And I teach freshman boys, and I realize that many people, right, especially with that capacity, do not listen and need 2 or 3 repeats. Last week we talked a little bit about this, and I've been sort of studying the running back chalk in weeks 3, 4, and now 5. The top 10, sometimes the top 10 to 15 of the highest owned running backs often end up being the only running backs worth rostering. So the chalky running backs, right, the top 10 running backs are the only ones worth rostering outside of a very small group. And this last week, the only solid score that was outside of the top 10 was Washington's Bill. And he hit for 31 points at 0.11% ownership in the power sweep. You did not need him to win. It was a nice score. But if you had looked outside of the top 10 running backs in the last 3 weeks, you would have produced more pain than pleasure in your DFS lineups. So I'll keep looking into that, and I want to keep exploring that. I looked at the top 10 running backs who I thought might be the top 10 owned this week. And again, it was very difficult searching outside of that for any play that I felt comfortable with. Watch this be the week where, 7 of those 10 fail, and you really need to choose the right ones. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that could happen, right? And that would be chaos. All right, let's get into some of the things we talked about last week, some of the biases that we talked about last week on the show. How did they work out? And what does that tell us again moving forward? What do we learn having recognized that bias? Maybe we had success. So one of the things I was looking at last week was the Seattle versus Tampa Bay game. I had talked about how in the OWS Discord, I had sort of brought up that game a couple times and just heard crickets. Right? No one wanted to react to the Seattle Tampa Bay game. JSN, of course, was chalky. We knew that would happen. I think people were playing him for more of a floor. If they had been playing him for a ceiling, they would have realized that he needed a spike in volume, and that was only really going to come if Tampa Bay kind of pushed on the scoreboard as well, which is what happened. And so teams with JSN and Igbuka on the bring back, maybe with Rashad White, but he wasn't necessary. Those teams had a lot of success. People were off of that game for a number of reasons. 2 really solid defenses. The Vegas total wasn't popping, but more than likely, no one was talking about it. Right? The narrative was simply out there about the Seattle defense. Tampa Bay had so many injuries. Right. Well, again, we're going to talk a little bit later again about Tampa Bay. and looking forward to them as a possible spot next week again to attack. We'll get to that at the end. But from this, I learn, and I continue to learn this point, that in many of the matchups, we can't simply dismiss a game as not worth our time. There are angles within almost all of the games where a team or players from that team can be interesting, and we should really be looking at those angles. But the only angles that are worth taking a chance on are the ones that can win a tournament. And clearly Seattle and Tampa Bay, right, two of the top offenses in the league as well, had the chance to put up a shootout, and they did. And it won people some money. Sadly, on my one main Darnold stack, I had Darnold with JSN and Puka. I included Elijah Arroyo as the tight end instead of AJ Barner. And I think if I had included Barner and his 2 touchdowns, we would have had something really nice last week. So we'll move on from that. Let's look ahead now at this week. This will probably be a little shorter podcast, but I'm going to spend a little bit more time looking ahead to some of the biases that people will be confronted of when making lineups this week. And the first one is in the New England at the Saints game. This is bound to be, I think, a popular spot. Because we have we have at least one team that really likes to play fast. But New England is going to be popular due to recency bias and a narrative bias, right? The narrative here is that New England, after knocking off Buffalo in Buffalo, right, now 3-2 with Drake May under center, that they are a potential playoff team, that New England, behind Coach Vrabel, is going to get back to the playoffs. And this is a narrative that is sort of driving this this image of New England as a strong team in DFS. It's probably also due to the lack of a lot of sort of top teams this week, and that New England stands out amongst the teams that are out there. There's an obvious recency bias for Stephon Diggs. He had a great game, right? It was against his old team. It was against the Bills, but he came ready to play. People are probably shocked that they upset the Bills, that it was Diggs himself who was really the catalyst of that game. And that's going to elevate New England stacks this week, especially when people are realizing that they are playing a game against an 0-4 team, right, who operates out of a no huddle at one of the highest rates in the league, who plays fast, right? People are going to be all over this stack of Drake May to Diggs. And yet, it only scored 40 DK points last week on a ceiling game for Diggs. The pair only scored 40. In fact, in week 1, May plus his top wide receiver only scored 36. In week 2, May plus his top running back scored 47, plus his top tight end in week 3 scored 50. Week 4 and 5, May plus Diggs scored 42 and 40. They cost about 12K this week, so 48 DK points are going to be needed to produce a 4X score. They have been close, but they have not hit that. And I'm wondering what it would take for them to go over that score. So while those pairs may be popular this week, it's likely due to a recency bias and a narrative bias surrounding New England, and not necessarily the ability they have to win you a tournament. All right, let's look to Arizona at Indianapolis. Arizona has a very public, again, negativity bias. I think every week there's a strong negativity bias. There's a backlash against that team or those players where people don't want to play them. Negativity bias is one of the strongest biases we have. It's why politicians, right, will throw out negative kind of attack ads. They want to keep people, sometimes they want to keep people away from elections. So they throw out these negative ads, which lead people to just sort of get sort of fed up with what's going on, and their brain sort of makes the easy decision to just leave it alone. There's too much negativity surrounding this team. Let's just leave it alone. So basically, the Arizona coach got into trouble for physical altercation with a player, trying to discipline that player and using physical contact. His apology was did not show any remorse or desire to change his behaviors, which tells me a lot about the coach. But this is a negativity bias, so people may avoid this team in this spot next week. Now, not all bias leads us in the wrong direction, right? Bias can affect our decision making, but it doesn't mean you have to go against the bias. That's not always the right answer, the right idea. When I look at this Arizona team, and there's other people around OWS that have been sort of calling out this coach, and the talk of never Kyler Murray is probably less about Kyler Murray and more about the coach. But let's look. In 2024, this Arizona team, they lost their last game to Carolina and got booted from the playoffs by allowing Carolina to come back against them. Now, this was in 2024, the end of last season. In week 2 of this season, they were leading Carolina 27-3 at halftime, and they allowed Carolina to come all the way back and almost win that game. Arizona didn't even score another point in that second half. They have lost 3 games in a row on a game-winning field goal by the other team. Perhaps the bias is on point in this case, and perhaps it is the coaching that is prohibiting this team from moving forward, from doing well. Anything can happen on the small sample of 1 week, but I'm not always interested in sort of shedding this negativity bias around this team. I realize that it sort of makes me want to stay away, and I will combat that feeling. I'll keep digging into this, especially the Indianapolis side. But it's possible, that this is just a bad spot, that the coaching is a little bit toxic, and that will affect the team. It's possible they make changes too as a team, and that those changes happen within 1 week. But most coaches are pretty confident, and this Arizona coach is no different. I expect just more of the same from him, which is an unappealing place to go without confidence in the Arizona coach being able to sort of stick with a high-scoring Indianapolis team in this spot. So it's likely I will continue to avoid this, but to recognize that a negativity bias is driving me away. And I want to be sure that I agree with that bias, that I want to trust that. All right, that was a good example of not just sort of eschewing bias, but using it again to engage in a line of questions that can maybe lead you to a different answer. All right, we said at the top of the show, all this chalk is hitting. So this week, let's play, sort of new team jam it in. For some people, it's Puka and CMC. For some people, it's Jonathan Taylor as well, right? Team jam them in was always fun because it was an easy decision, right? Le'Veon Bell and some other running back. Just put them in. It's an easy decision. You don't have to worry about it, and you rack up the points. Right, that's how bias works. Our minds want easy decisions. They want places of comfort, of certainty, and in this case, right, we'd have a high certainty of 20-point scores probably with these three. But at their salaries, we need a lot more. The last couple of weeks, these players have really made a lot of sense. They've been good plays because we've had the QB value of 2 weeks ago, and last week we had all the running back value. But if we don't get such crazy value this week, right, these plays are going to be less appealing because they aren't going to be able to get you the 4x and 5x multipliers that some of these lower cost options will. So especially as a block of 3 players, I think this is probably a bad decision, an easy decision that will turn out bad. And even possibly with the 2 of them, I think what's appealing about these plays is that you can slot one of them in and capture a real floor while hoping for the ceiling. And again, what is the probability of all 3 hitting their ceiling outcome on the same week? Think about that, right, when you are playing something like this. All right, let's look ahead to Cincinnati at Green Bay because we have a situation here, right? We have a new quarterback in Joe Flacco that's coming over. Is going to create again a lot of bias. There's the novelty bias, which we always get when we have a new sort of player to a team, especially the quarterback. As I was studying offense and the stickiness of offense from year to year, one of the factors in that was right that the team had the same quarterback usually, the same scheme, and a good offensive line is usually something that maintained through multiple seasons. In this case, Flacco is going to be the quarterback in Cincinnati. Some of us may remember his fantastic 2023 in Cleveland. But in 2024, he had only one 30-pointer, and he has 6 disappointing games for DFS. In 2025, he has 4 disappointing games so far for DFS. Now, Joe Flacco, we don't know the upside of the Cincinnati team with Joe Flacco. We don't know whether they will let him sort of throw as much as he wants, let him, throw it downfield. We kind of don't know what to expect. We can imagine he's slotting in to do about the same thing that Jake Browning was called on to do. But Joe Flacco does have, a little bit more of an arm. So we can also speculate, right, that he may get something more downfield. He's older, though, right? His accuracy is possible has fallen off. So there's a lot of question marks here. And while the novelty bias says his ceiling is unlimited because we haven't seen it yet, the reality is that, and I am framing this in a certain way, which reflects a bias. He has 10 sort of disappointing games in the last 2 years and 1 game which you really needed him to win the tournaments. For me, the real question is, can Joe Flacco keep Jamar Chase viable as an option week in and week out? Jake Browning, right, made Jamar Chase an option in 2 separate weeks. Basically, Jamar Chase is viable anytime he scores 2 touchdowns. If you just go back and look over his game logs, he did that 7 times in 2024. He's done that once so far this year. Can Jamar Chase score 2 touchdowns with Joe Flacco behind center? Yeah, I think he can. So I will still be playing Jamar Chase as much as I would have, knowing though that in that case, I may not get to. I don't know. I'm really just thinking about this now. If Joe Flacco's price is so low, you're going to want to play Joe Flacco with Jamar Chase. Once Joe Flacco's price rises after a week, like if Jamar Chase doesn't hit this week and Joe Flacco goes up to 5K or something, you're probably going to want to just roster Jamar Chase alone. So that's kind of what I'm looking at going forward. This week, against Green Bay, again, depending on ownership, Jamar Chase is or is not an option for me. All right. Let's look at the Chargers at Miami. I had thought initially, right, that the game that I was sort of seeing an angle on this week was San Francisco at Tampa Bay. And I had teased earlier in the show that I might talk about that at the end. It very well might be, right. Tampa Bay and San Francisco, I think, have the 9th and 10th best offenses, in spite of losing so many players. Well, they still don't really have those players back. And while Tampa Bay and San Francisco, right, have this ability to get first downs, to continually get first downs, to convert third downs, right? That's one of their skills. That's what keeps those offenses ranked highly. Tampa Bay has the ability to hit the big play, right? San Francisco, again, we haven't quite seen it as much this year, but if they can hit the big play, right, that would elevate the game as well. But I seem to like this Chargers at Miami game even a little more. And so this is kind of my bias check game of the week. Didn't know I was going to be doing this, but it's been pretty successful over the last few weeks. Why do I call this the bias check game of the week? Well, I think there is a bias around the Chargers. It's a primacy bias, right? They have been a high, a pass-heavy team. They have the highest PROE in the league through at least the first 4 weeks. I haven't checked after week 5, but I do know that in week 5, they ran the ball a lot. They ran it 27 times. They had a negative PROE this week. So they haven't been able to run the ball. They run it 27 times. And that was with Omari and Hampton and with other various running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, that they are trying to run the ball. I speculated last week that the Chargers needed to run the ball, that all of the top offenses had good running games, and that if they wanted to sort of increase their scoring output, that they would need to sort of balance out their attack. And that while the primacy bias says that they started the season as pass heavy, that's who they're always going to be. Teams can adapt and change throughout the season, and the coaching styles may reflect a desire to do that, right? Harbaugh, we often think of as a run-first coach. Let's dig a little bit into this team and the narrative that kind of surrounds it. What is the story that tells the truth about the Chargers? Well, it's obvious that they are trying to avoid the pass rush, that had affected them in the weeks leading up to the game last week against Washington. And that they didn't want Washington, who has a decent pass rush, right, to get to them, either to get to Herbert, right, to injure him, or to disrupt what they were doing. So they ran more. Well, this week they get Miami, who has a weak pass rush, and that's going to be music to Herbert's ears, right, because his team has one of the worst pass blocking offensive lines per PFF grades. This week they get Miami, who has one of the weakest pass rushes, and so I think the Chargers, while they know that they need to balance the run and the pass over the season, right? Even though we saw 27 runs last week, and we know Omari and Hampton is out, they're probably going to run less. But especially in this spot, it's a clear passing spot against one of the worst defenses in the NFL, right? Almost as bad statistically as Dallas. So the Chargers should be throwing this week, and they should be very successful at it because I think Herbert's going to have a lot of time back there. Miami's offense, on the other hand, is very concentrated. It's not super special, but they're still going to seek out Waller, right, in the intermediate portions of the field. They're going to have chunk gains, especially if they're in comeback mode. Right, I don't really think that they can keep up with the Chargers. I don't quite expect the Chargers, though, to pull away too much. They they have lacked aggressiveness throughout the season. But there's a lot of things I think which are, again, people have biases about these two teams, about especially the Chargers. And I think that if we recognize that bias and look at the narrative, why they've been throwing so much, what happened last week, what do we think they're going to do moving forward? I think it's an offense that we can get on board with this week. And I may be sort of leaning into some double stacks here of Herbert, but at least Quentin Johnson, because I think that the Chargers are going to need Quentin Johnson to spread the field and attack deep, and they will have success if they do that as well as they have been doing early on in the season. All right. Before we wrap up for today, I'm wearing a sweatshirt. Gosh, it's the first time I've worn a sweatshirt in a long time. I live in Chicago. It's getting colder here. So let's just say a word about the weather this week and late swap. Remember, omission bias says that we are going to be more hurt by harmful action than harmful inaction. Right. That's why sometimes we don't like to change things. We don't like to late swap or change when time is tight. But we do need to act on the late news, right? The late news is often the most profitable news because the least amount of people are able to react to it or react well. So the weather's going to be changing, right? Often we get word about the weather kind of late in the week, and especially late maybe on a Sunday. And we kind of need to have a plan. Before I kind of give you my plan for the weather, and again, it's a plan. It's not it's kind of a loose plan. But last week I made a couple late swaps. I had a little bit of time, and I made a couple late swaps. So I switched on to Rico Dowdle, who I was not on. But I mean, the case was made, and I was not on him because of Carolina's sort of ineptitude as a team. But again, the pricing for him and the possibility that with the workload, right, he would be successful. And as his ownership started climbing, I really wanted to get on Rico Dowdle. So great, yay, right? I did that. But I got off of Javonte Williams, right? Boo, sort of changed that ownership. And I got off of Javonte Williams because of there were a few people who were sort of less than intrigued about him, and we started to get word of his offensive line, sort of a lot of his offensive line missing the game. So we got off of him, right? Okay, one thing was good, one thing was not. But again, we late swapped. I'm gonna keep late swapping as long as it makes sense to me, recognizing that in this case, right, I was at the same time hurt by harmful action and hurt by harmful inaction. Sorry, I totally messed that up. I was aided by action, right? That was good. And I avoided inaction by going for Dowdle, but then my action was harmful in getting rid of Javonte Williams. I also put in CJ Stroud for Daniel Jones, which again, I think was a good move for a lot of reasons. I wanted to do that. CJ Stroud played great, but one of the things that happens when you're making these late swaps is you can kind of forget about some of the other DFS strategies. And the idea that, when you roster Stroud, you don't necessarily get that other play right because the pairings for Texans are not as obvious as you might think. So it's hard to get multiple positions right on that team. I also took down my Fields ownership for Bryce Young. Kind of the FOMO, it's kind of a FOMO behind that play where I didn't want to miss Bryce Young and Ted McMillan. So we did that, right? And I always work on my late swaps, try to make that a part of my game. But the weather is going to also force our hand on some of these Sunday mornings going ahead. Have a plan, right? Have a limit to the wind speed that you're willing to put up with, directions you're going to tolerate, right? Rain levels, temperature. It was put out there in an athletic article, maybe last season. Just remember 15, 25, 35, right? 15 miles per hour is generally an okay wind that you don't need to worry about it, but 25 is something you need to worry about in terms of wind. And then 35 is a temperature, 35 and below Fahrenheit. You got to start worrying about the effect on the offensive output. So again, just wanted to put that out there as we move into some of the colder months. That's gonna make some things difficult. All right, ODBiz family, we're gonna get out of here. Hopefully you played this on 1.5x speed, and I will be seeing all of you in the Discord this week at the top of the leaderboards, and hoping you can recognize the bias and succeed in making it work for you. All right. Thank you. Peace. I'm out.